Welcome back to the Metro on WDET, Detroit Public Radio. I'm Robin Vincent. Eve Ewing is an author, poet, and a professor of sociology at the University of Chicago. Before she became a professor, Ewing was a middle school teacher for Chicago Public Schools. She's since spent several years thinking about how schools work and uncovering the historic wounds that explain how education today has fallen short, particularly for children of color. In her book, Ghosts in the Schoolyard, she details how the city of Chicago closed 53 schools and the neighborhood impacts. In her newest book, Original Sin, The Miseducation of Black and Native Children and Construction of American Racism, Ewing situates the construction of American schools alongside American slavery and the attempted genocide of Native Americans. She argues they're used as a tool to condition Black and Native communities. While schools here in Michigan are struggling to develop students' reading and math skills, producer Carrie Jr. II wanted to know how Ewing defines intelligence. Here's that conversation.
Can you kind of first explain how you define the work you do?
Oh, that's a great question. I kind of categorize the work that I do across two different arenas. One is I do the work of trying to understand the world that we live in and how it got to be this way. I really believe that, history and the paths we tread illuminate where we find ourselves. And the other half of my work is really trying to imagine how the world could be otherwise. And so that takes many different forms. That means like in my community, trying to build relationships among and between people. And it means also doing like speculative and imagination work of thinking about how we have other spaces of possibility that we can dwell in. So that's kind of how that's the, woo-woo way of how I talk about my work, how I think about it. But on a more simple level, I write things, I teach about stuff, and I spend time with people.
Why did you become a teacher to begin with?
I love kids. I love being around kids. I think it remains the greatest privilege of my life to have been a public school teacher, because it means that, folks around you, members of your community, members of the public are entrusting you with their most precious and irreplaceable beloved children. And that's just a huge responsibility, but it's also like tremendously intellectually challenging work and then really rewarding work. And it helped me understand, so many things about the world, about people, about growing up. I always wanted, my mom, when I was growing up, was always doing some type of job that had to do with like being in service or trying to make the world better in some type of way. And so I felt like it was really special to have a way that I could try to do that also brought me a lot of joy.
That's the perspective I don't often hear about why people become teachers. I mean, most teachers do love kids, but the idea that it's intellectually stimulating, that it teaches you something about the world, I don't think I've ever heard someone say that about teaching. Can you kind of unpack that a bit? How so?
Yeah, I appreciate that observation, because that idea of teaching that doesn't really account for like the intellectual or the cognitive or also the political dimensions of the work. That's very historically grounded. I mean, in the United States, historically, the teaching profession has been a feminized profession, and it has been a profession that, has been systematically denied labor rights and autonomy and agency. And there's a way in which this work, this crucial, societally transforming work, is really seen as something anybody could do. It's something that, is very simple and simplistic. It's babysitting, but I think that work that is historically done by women, work that has to do with caring for people, work that has to do with children, is always in our society marginalized in that way. But, if you have ever had the situation of like trying to explain to somebody what a fraction is and how a fraction works, and you come up with one way of explaining it, and then like that doesn't work for that person, and you have to pivot and think, what are 3 other ways that I might explain the concept of a fraction, which is this very abstract notion that at the same time is like something all of us encounter in our everyday lives. And that's hard and complicated, and that's also what I find so immensely satisfying. It's really teaching is so much the work of not only caretaking somebody's, a young person's heart, their spirit, their drive, their sense of self, but also caretaking their, being a caretaker for their mind and helping them understand the world in which they live and giving them the tools to understand the world in which they live. And that's just like not easy. It's really hard. That's really hard to do. And it's really hard to do, when you wake up at 5 a.m. and, you show up and it's like there are 30 people in front of you that are at a transformative, like pivotal fulcrum moment of their life. And the conversations that you have with them, the things that you introduce them to, the way you treat them actually like has the potential to transform the trajectory of all the years ahead. That's a lot of pressure, and I think that that's every bit as intellectually demanding as anything else you could be doing with your time.
I feel like as someone who works in journalism, our job is to figure out the story, understand kind of concepts of what's happening, and then explain it to folks who are probably less familiar with that subject. And that's like, those are adults we're talking about. When it comes to
that's hard.
That's hard. But then you know how people say like you really understand the subject when you can explain it to someone like they're 5, I forget the actual grade.
Yeah.
That is essentially your everyday, right? But it's like the concepts of the entire world. It makes me think about when young people always ask the question, well, why is that? And you have to be like, well, now I have to explain something that to an adult, they would understand that concept. But now I have to find some really simple language to break that down. And as you said, that can be an intellectually taxing job.
And to me, I don't know, to me, that's like kind of addictive. Like, I think that constant, because it allows you as the teacher to reposition yourself as a learner over and over and over. And that means that you get to rediscover, the world anew all the time. And I think that that's really amazing. I mean, there are always these viral videos of like, a baby tasting ice cream for the first time or tasting pizza for the first time or whatever. And those things go viral because all of us want to re-inhabit that space of being able to look at the world and saying, and understand that like, magic is everywhere, right? And the everyday situations in which we find ourselves are so phenomenal and inscrutable to us. Like, that's really cool. And so to me, when a young person asks like, why is this, or how does this work, or that doesn't make any sense, or that contradicts the thing that you said yesterday, I'm like, you know what? Yeah, let's go. Like, let's go from there. And that's like exhilarating to me. So many people, when they find out that I was a middle school teacher, they're like terrified of middle school, and they're like, oh, wow, you're a saint. But to me, what I love about that age is it's this really special combination of, on the one hand, like having the cognitive and emotional sophistication to really start to drill down into like deep philosophical questions about life. And on the other hand, having like a kind of sincerity of emotion where like you just feel really hard. And I find that really cool. And everything is new. I find that super cool. So I love middle school. I love that age. And I know that is not always a majority opinion, but maybe it just means that I'm kind of like trapped at age 12 myself a little bit.
So to the point of intelligence and intellect, standardized testing is known to have its shortcomings, and it's criticized as to whether it's the proper way to assess student achievement and as a result, student intelligence. How do you define it? How do you define intellect?
Wow, nobody's ever asked me that before, and what a great challenging question. I mean, I think so much of our society is structured around really, really narrow and restrictive notions of what intelligence is that can be really harmful and really, honestly, very violent. For me, the word is like, I've become a little bit allergic to, the word intelligence and words like smart and genius, just because they do have those legacies of harm. But for me, intelligence is about having the capability that you need to navigate the worlds that are important that you occupy. And so that includes your social world, that includes your interior, like spiritual and emotional world, that includes your sense of obligation to your community and to the people who love you, people you love. That includes your relationship to the more than human world, to lands and waters. And so all of us have different capabilities and different ways of being in our bodies and our hearts and our minds that make life amazing, right? And that if we're lucky, allow us to thrive. And I think that like one of the great tragedies of the schooling system, as we've constructed it, is that we issue these like rewards and punishments that are based on a very, 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 very narrow slice of what is in fact like infinite capability.
Like
And so,
grades or tests.
yeah, grades or tests, or I mean, even like for example, I'm a highly verbal person. I like to talk. I like to
Hmm.
chit chat. I like to yap, right? That's just who I am.
Hmm.
And there are ways that, part of my success in life, part of my material success in life is that there's a thumb on the scale of valuing verbal performance in school, right? And that benefited me as a kid. It still benefits me. And throughout my life, I've had to learn so much about silence, about stillness, about quiet, about peace, about waiting, right? About reflection. And those lessons have been so vital to my own sustenance. And yet, like, we really devalue that in school, right? If we think about silence in school, we often think about it as it relates to like compliance and discipline, right? To sit silently and not talk. But where do we create space to think about valuing reflection, to value like taking a beat, right? That the person, if you ask a question and one person's hand shoots up and they answer it immediately, and there's somebody else that like sat and thought and reflected about the same thing and came to a different revelation a week later, how do we make space for that? And so, we can think about this as it pertains to the joy people find in their body and movement, people's skill in the arts, right? People's skill as like community connectors, or, their relationships to other people. There are so many ways to be brilliant in the world, and we've randomly picked a very, very small subsection of them to decide that we care about in, Western society.
You're listening to The Metro on 1019 WDET. I'm Kerry Jr. II. I'm speaking with Eve Ewing. She's an author, poet, and professor at the University of Chicago. She's written a lot about how we think about schools and schooling. And right now we're discussing how we measure or even determine and define intelligence. So Eve, is it randomly picked? Because you're speaking about this legacy of harm. I suspect you're also pulling on the knowledge you acquired while writing your latest book, Original Sins. And in that book, you outline how education was a deliberate tool, kind of similar to slavery and the genocide of Native Americans. Or am I drawing too many lines together
No,
that aren't
you got
necessarily
it.
okay? Can you
No, you
talk
got
about
it.
that? Talk about how deliberate, I guess, it was.
When you start to talk about this stuff, it can come across as like a sort of tinfoil hat conspiracy. And like, it doesn't have to come down to individual people making individual choices, but they're a way that our culture moves us toward a set of behaviors that we decide to value. And the culture of the United States is a capitalist culture. It is a competitive, hyper individualist culture. It is a culture that takes place in a political, economic, and social world that was built upon the enslavement of Black people and the genocide of Indigenous peoples, right? And so when we think about that, those things are absolutely connected. And even some of the most interesting texts that I found myself engaging with for the book were things where you see the legacy of this kind of celebration of capitalism, and folks saying very explicitly, we need schools to teach Black people, to teach Native people that they need to compete and participate in a capitalist society. For me, some of the most interesting texts that I encountered in researching Original Sins were texts in which, folks in power were saying explicitly that they really wanted to send Black and Native people to school in order to get the idea that this is a capitalist society, that they need to work and labor as much as possible, that they need to accumulate wealth, that they need to try to spend that wealth. And they were very explicit about the idea that, schooling was partially valuable as a tool to inculcate in people this idea that they had to compete in a market. And so, if you design a system that is about pushing people towards market competition, that is a system that rewards loudness. That is a system that rewards individualism. That is a system that rewards speed, right? That is a system that rewards compliance. And all those things are antithetical to the many other ways in which, we could and can be learning together, right? I think that like it's one of the most important lessons that I've learned from many people that I admire in the last several years is to constantly push myself to think about education beyond the bounds of what we understand as schooling, right? And so, like, if one young person and their grandparent are taking a walk by a river and learning about different types of fish that live in that river, right? Like, that is also an educational experience. In Chicago, where I live, when you go through the parks or along the lakefront early in the morning, you often see, two or three folks from different generations in a family fishing, right? And I think about everything that all the education that has to happen in that space for that to work, right? For that to take place. All the education about patience, all the education about the natural world, all the education about the rhythms of the water. And then the other discussions that probably happen, right? Like the stories that get told, the memories that get shared and made, or the process of just like sitting quietly together. That is an educational space. And I think it's become increasingly important to me to think about, even though I care a lot about public schools for a lot of reasons, at the same time, it's also really important to me to push myself and push others to think about education as encompassing something like that as well.
But what about the idea that maybe this is just the path we chose, and what's wrong with this option? Yes, there could be other ways to explore your intellect, but what's the harm in deciding that being the first, being the loudest is the way that we want to construct our society?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot wrong with it. One is that the we is, right, the black proverb, it calls to mind the black proverb of like, who is we, right? Like the we who made those decisions and who continue to make those decisions are not necessarily people that have all of our best wishes or needs in mind. And then all you have to do is look around and understand and see the many, many ways in which so many brilliant young people are not being served and celebrated by our schools. Two headlines that are really on my heart a lot these days are, number one, the ways that supports for disabled students are being eroded, special education supports and guarantees, which already for many years have been guaranteed on paper and so often not implemented in practice, how those things are eroded, and the attempts to attack Head Start, right? And to say, to draw new restrictions on who can and cannot send their kids to Head Start. And I really, really, really believe that a kid who is undocumented or a kid who is unhoused or a kid whose parents are dealing with a substance misuse disorder still deserves a great early childhood education, right? And I really, really believe that a kid who is disabled, whatever that disability may look like, or multiple disabilities, that they really deserve a place where they are celebrated, seen, and understood as a learner of a person of potential. Competing, if everything is about survival of the fittest, then it becomes really easy to discard those kids. And, every one of those children is somebody's baby. So that's something to me that is worth fighting for.
Can you explain how we know that this capitalistic society, which you are saying informs how we measure intellect, will not provide more vulnerable populations opportunities to be considered competent or intelligent?
Well, I think that we create scarcity where there is none. And we create scarcity and the idea that all of us are not able to thrive in a world, and specifically in an unspeakably affluent nation full of unspeakably affluent people, right? Like, I think it was really important. I think it's been really important in the last few years to even like get people to understand like how much $1 billion is, that we have these billionaires walking around, and the absolute scale of wealth that entails, and the ways in which, the fact that somebody can walk around with $1 billion and there is a child on the street that is going hungry is unconscionable. And it's permissible because we've decided that it's permissible, right? And not everybody, but like people in power have decided that is permissible. And so we absolutely live in a country where we have what we need for every single child. I think it's important to expand this conversation. One of the most initially encouraging and then really troubling things that has come out of COVID is, this our understanding of how people think that folks are disposable, right? And I think that there was a moment of terror. There's this moment of understanding where it's like, hey, this is going to be a mass disabling event, that there are going to be people coming out of this situation whose lives are radically changed. And never mind the fact that, in an aging society, all of us become disabled eventually, right? All of us find ourselves in a situation where we do need help from other people. We do need support from other people. And instead of saying, hey, we have enough for everybody, let's make sure that every child has a great school that meets their needs. Let's make sure that everybody has great healthcare. Let's make sure that everybody has housing. We spend all this time bickering and making people prove that they are worthy of something that should be a given, And we see that in schools, and we see that with other things. We see that with healthcare. We see that with folks wanting to tie things like SNAP benefits and housing assistance to the idea that you should work, right? And you know what? There are people in our society that, for whatever reason, are never going to be able to go out and get competitive jobs because they have disabilities, because that's not something that is accessible to them, right? Those people are not disposable because they can't, go out and prove their worthiness within a capitalist infrastructure by, performing a certain kind of labor. And so I think, we extend that same logic to our children, and it's devastating.
You're listening to a conversation between author, poet, and sociologist Eve Ewing and Metro producer Carrie Jr. II. We'll jump right back into this conversation after the break. This is the Metro on WDET. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Metro on WDET, Detroit Public Radio. I'm Robin Vincent. Eve Ewing has spent years rethinking how schools should work. She's an author, poet, and professor of sociology at the University of Chicago. Ewing believes we need to radically change how we view and measure intelligence. In a conversation with producer Carrie Jr. II, she explained how she believes we go about rethinking it.
So now I want to get back to our ideas about measuring intellect, determining what intellect is, and how we nurture that in actual schools, and just kind of the delineation between what makes a school good. I know over the years you've kind of interrogated what a good school kind of looks like. If we are going to actually give all students those options and opportunities, what would that actually look like for them to nurture intelligence, not just score well on a test, not just, perform this A grade paper?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to do the really annoying thing and say that some of that, I think that there's like a baseline level of that, and then some of that has to be determined by communities. So one is, part of why I say, even as so much of what I'm talking about is about thinking beyond schools, part of why I will remain a fierce advocate for public schools is that they are one of the last semi-functional safety nets of our society, right? And so public schools are a place where, in theory, it doesn't always work in practice, but in theory, legally, despite the current administration's, attempts to systematically deny these rights to all different kinds of people, any kid can show up and get an education. And what they get expanded from that is, a set of adults that hopefully, theoretically, care about them, love them. For many kids, that's where they are getting their meals. For many kids, that's where they're getting their housing assistance, their transportation assistance. Right. For many kids, that's where they're getting their mental health care, right? So many of us in March 2020 and April 2020 were saying, hey, you know what? We need to close schools for public safety, but also what is our plan for making sure that kids eat, right? And it is really telling that out of all these other, social systems that we value, schools have become kind of one of the last bastions of anything approaching, universal care or universal provision in our deeply miserly country. And so I think that some of what is important in a school would actually become less important if we expanded that conversation to say, like, how are we accountable to children, families, and everybody outside of school, right? So, like, the weight on school becomes a little bit lessened if every single kid has a safe place to live, right? The weight on school becomes a little bit lessened if all these parents have adequate mental health care so that, depression and anxiety and PTSD are not, inhibiting people's abilities to be the parents that they want to be. The weight gets lifted off school a little bit if we don't have kids going hungry, right? And so that, I think a lot of the pressure that we currently put on schools to be everything for every person is partially because in other arenas of our society, we've completely abdicated those responsibilities. So if we think more broadly about like, what do we owe each other? What do we owe kids? What do we owe families and communities and people? Then that allows us to get to the fun part, right? And the fun part is, we can and should have and deserve schools where every single child has a way of being nurtured and celebrated in a way that is responsive to them, their families, their personality, their community, where they are and who they want to be in the world. And for some young people, that might look like being educated inside the four walls of a building. And for some young people, that might mean being outside. And that means more opportunities for intergenerational relationships. And that means more opportunities for making art, right? Like that's going to mean so many different things for so many different kids and families and people and communities. But I think that we open up space to be more imaginative and to serve our young folks better when we also understand that like those basics have to be in place. And it doesn't make sense that we've put that entirely on schools and teachers. And it's one institution is never going to be all things for all people.
Well, so this might be an unfair question, but I'm curious to know if you could wave your own kind of magic wand. Obviously, life circumstances play a role in students' performances, but let's say that's not the factor here. Just about the schools, their main focus is educating and nurturing children, as you're saying. What would, I guess, a school system look like? I know every neighborhood is different, so I'm curious to like, how does that play out for you?
Well, I've been in education now for about 20 years, and every time I go to the dentist or get in a cab or go to a dinner party, somebody tells me that the answer is for all kids to have iPads. And if only all the kids had iPads, everything would be great. And if I had a nickel for all the time somebody told me that all the kids need iPads, I would have enough money to buy all the kids iPads. But that is not my answer. I think that if I could wave a very, very magic wand and make one change, assuming, like you said, that all the other stuff is in place, food and housing and clean water and clean air and all those things, I think it would be endowing people who have decision-making power to think critically about the place that they are, like the place that they sit. And I mean that like the geographic place, the place in the natural world, and the social place. And to really strive to bring that into teaching and learning in a way that also uplifts. Now I'm kind of cheating because I'm packaging two together, but in a way that uplifts young people's autonomy as learners and teachers themselves. So what I mean by that is, like I live in Chicago. I was born and raised in Chicago. It's really important to me that kids here can read. It's really important to me that kids here can do math. And it's really important to me that kids here understand the history of the Great Migration and the many different waves of migration that have shaped the foundations of this city. It's really important to me that kids here understand that this is a prairie, that these are prairie lands, right? And what are the animals and plants that live in the prairie lands, and what are our relationships to them? It's really important to me that kids have a relationship to Lake Michigan and to the Chicago River. It's really important to me that kids have relationships to the many seniors and elders that they might interact with every day, right? And to understand the political structure of the city and how we participate in it and how we change it. Once I say to myself, like, I'm going to sit around and look around where I am and think about how this place can guide my pedagogical choices, so many things open up. And that's not like a kind of parochialism, although I am like a major Chicago booster. But I think that like that, if you understand the relationship to the lands and waters and ancestors and political structures and histories and arts and culture of the place that you live, it helps you be a more settled and loving and intellectually curious person who's prepared to bring that love and that intellectual curiosity to the way that you interact with other people and the way you shape the world. And that kind of education is going to look really different in Northern California. That education is going to look really different in rural Arkansas, or, along the southwestern border. But I think that so much comes from that that I think is really powerful.
Do you see this happening anywhere? I guess I'll say I was going to say U.S., but I guess we'll take the world. Do you see this type of implementation where the education system is taking into account their actual place, how it informs what the student needs to know for them to be better humans?
I was going to say yes until you said the education system part.
I
think that everywhere flowers are blooming. Everywhere flowers are blooming. Everywhere I go, I meet phenomenal educators of all ages, including children themselves, including community organizers and folks outside of formal schooling places, including elders, right? Everywhere I go, I meet people that are doing absolutely extraordinary work to say we are going to center this need for flourishing in all of our decisions and in all that we do. And I remain so inspired by that. And I think that, the work is how we empower those people and how we make sure that they have the money and the space and the support and the opportunities for ongoing learning that they need in order for those things to become systems. I think the tricky thing is that we're addicted to systems and scaling as a kind of one size fits all proposition, right? And so my argument here is not that all kids should do Lake Michigan School, because I think that kids here should do Lake Michigan School, right? But rather that it's a set of questions and orientation toward the world that I think is what we need to scale. And I think that's hard. But I don't think it's impossible.
Yeah, I guess to kind of go back to one, blame me for relying on systems, but I guess if you were to measure how we, whether we've successfully developed the intellect or intelligence of young people, what would that look like? What is the measurement? What's the metric?
I say with care, my loving challenge to that question is that I think that the assumption that we need to measure it is itself an artifact of a system that I don't think I really believe in anymore. Are you in love with somebody in your life? Are you in a partnership or a relationship
with
the person you love? So I would never ask you what is the measurement of that love, right? Like, how do you know if it's growing? How do you know if it's struggling, right? If that's what you want to know, if you say, hey, I'm having a hard time in my relationship, or I feel like things are really thriving right now. Those are things that you could figure out in conversation, through process, with people that you trust, right? Like with your partner, with other people that you both care about, in moments of reflection. I would never say that it feels really important for you to come up with like a scale that you can measure every single day, like how your relationship is going, right? I certainly wouldn't say that about my own relationships. I wouldn't say that about my own joy, right? I wouldn't say that about but even my own learning and things that I care about. I'm an avidly bad piano player. I love to learn to play the piano, and I love it because I didn't start learning until I was 35 years old. And so I'm a really slow, inefficient piano player, which means that every single thing that I learn is like a huge deal to me. And because I'm doing it solely for the joy of being a learner, until you asked me the question, it would never have occurred to me to be like, on a scale of 1 to 10, where are you at, right? So this is a belabored way of saying, I think for the things that we really care about, the relationships that we really care about, we understand intuitively that measurement is at best inaccurate and at worst potentially harmful. And it doesn't mean that we can't figure out, how do we improve? How do we strive to get better? But maybe there's a space for those things to happen in a more holistic way that still holds people accountable, but that doesn't attach numbers to kids and their brains.
That was Eve Ewing speaking with the Metro's Carey Jr. II. Ewing is an author, poet, and sociology professor from the University of Chicago. Her latest book is Original Sins: The Miseducation of Black and Native Children and the Construction of American Racism. Coming up, we'll hear from Sounds Like Detroit featured artist Tariq Gardner. That's next here on The Metro. Stay with us.